I'm Chance Dorland, and this is In-Depth, an interview program from expressnews.com where you'll find in-depth reporting and other resources concerning every topic you'll hear discussed on the podcast. San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau is back on the program today to discuss a recent update to the 2017 Sutherland Springs shooting and how victims' families, as well as those who survived, are trying to move on with their lives. So, Silvia, great to have you back here on the podcast. To start off, let's kind of go back to the beginning. Why don't we quickly go through some details of what happened last year and how you, as an education reporter at the time, came to do so much reporting on what happened in Sutherland Springs?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. So I was an education reporter last year, and I was filling in for a coworker on Sunday, November 5th, and that's when the Sutherland Springs shooting occurred. It's the fifth deadliest mass shooting in the United States and the deadliest in modern Texas history as well. 26 people were killed at the First Baptist Church of Sutherland Springs, and then 20 others were injured. A gunman basically just came in and opened fired while they were in their Sunday services. 45 minutes, I'd say, from downtown San Antonio. It's southeast of San Antonio. It's a one-stoplight town. It's got $2 Generals, a post office, a church, and the Dollar General, too. And that's kind of all right near that intersection. And then there are houses clustered around that, and then in the rural countryside around it as well. So really small community for such a big, massive tragedy that occurred there. I was kind of dispatched there immediately once the news broke. And then from then on, I was down there probably 2-3 weeks every day after that happened. And then since then, I've been regularly following them as their local paper. This is the time when local newspapers can really show what they're good for. And we've been following the recovery of a lot of survivors and keeping in touch with victims' family members, and just kind of chronicling their lives ever since then.
And so in addition to all these stories that you've filed for the Express News, which you can check out at expressnews.com, you've also been on the In-Depth podcast, if memory serves, at least twice, talking about updates of what's going on with the Sutherland Springs survivors, their families, the victims' families. And within the last week, you have another update on that involving some controversy that has been popping up related to donations. Tell me about that.
Yeah, so it actually starts a while back. In April was when the controversy of donations bubbled up. It was around the same time that it was announced that the North American Mission Board, which is part of the Southern Baptist Convention, would be donating funds for the Sutherland Springs church members to get a new church building right adjacent to their old building, which has been their place of worship, has since been converted into a memorial for those that were lost. And they're kind of in a makeshift temporary facility right next door right now. So that was announced. It was $3 million completely donated. It's going to be this huge, compared to what the old building is, a really big church right next to it. And there's this Facebook group that was kind of dedicated to supporting survivors and victims' family members and praying for them and positive messages. And that Facebook group just dissolved into bitter disputes. Victims' family members started questioning why is this $3 million getting put toward the building that should be getting put towards the people? How are funds being distributed anyway? I haven't gotten any money and my daughter was killed. And it just it got really ugly to the point where that Facebook page was frozen. And during the Sunday services, Pastor Frank Pomeroy kept urging for unity amid division. It was really causing a lot of strife, especially for church leaders. They cried about this. It was really, for such, people gave all this money in such a charitable spirit. And I think it was really hard for them to see all of this money of goodwill, being turned ugly. And so I reported on that in April and basically kind of laid out, what the complaints were and then also what their system for distribution to victim relief is, which is a needs-based system. So people will submit an application every time there's an expense and with a receipt attached to it. And there's a restoration committee at the church that will then kind of reimburse them for those expenses. And that was a relatively new, having a formalized form was kind of one of the developments that came out of the controversy, because before that, it wasn't as formal of a process. And I think that just speaks a lot to the fact that you had a very small congregation dealing with a very large amount of money and other forms of donation. So that all happened in April. And then one of the kind of points of contention too was that nobody knew how much money the church had raised. A lot of money had been sent directly to the church, and the church was holding off on relaying that information to the media or to church congregation. This Sunday that changed, and they came forward with what that number is.
And so, yeah, that's the big change we're talking about now. I believe the numbers were given out during what I believe was described as an informal meeting after the church services on Sunday. So what was that number and how was that all delivered to the community?
So they had announced that they would be having an informal meeting a while back. And then last Sunday, they announced again during church services, we're having this meeting. You can stay if you want. You don't have to, but we're going to be talking about, how much was raised. And really not a lot of people stayed on. And just observing, looking around, so it's hard to know for sure, but none of the people that I knew had been particularly upset about the church's handling of the funds were there at that meeting. And one of the women, Lisa McNulty, whose daughter was killed in November and who has been raising the grandchildren, her daughter's children on her own since then, she didn't know what that figure was until I called her and asked her for comment about it. But basically, there was a meeting. It didn't take longer than 20 minutes for sure. And they announced that it was nearly $3 million that the church had raised. And so this is separate from the $3 million that is going toward building the church. That $3 million, as I mentioned before, was from the North American Mission Board, as well as, I should add, the Belden Construction, which is San Antonio based. And it also doesn't take into account the money that was sent to the church, but was written out to specific individuals. That money was just kind of forwarded on to those individuals. And it also doesn't take into account the various GoFundMes, which easily raised over $1 million in total on their own for the different family members.
So to try to figure out how all this would work, I think what you just mentioned was that if I donated, say, $500,000 to the church, but I said specifically, I want this to go to this survivor, the family of this victim, they would just send that directly to that group. And so this $3 million that they talked about at this informal meeting after church services this last Sunday, this was money that was just donated to the church. Here's money to the church. You guys handle it, as opposed to a specific individual or a family member.
Yeah. And within that $3 million, there were some designations, as they called them. So the majority wasn't designated. About $2 million could be spent however the church wants to, whether that's salaries, whether that's lights, whether you name it. Like it's up to them to decide on that. About $840,000 was dedicated generally to victim relief, but not, again, specifically to a specific family or person. And then the remainder of the money, some people had said for funerals or for the church's food pantry and other kind of items like that. But the overwhelming number was undesignated. And then that $840,000, which was kind of second up to that, was just generally for victim relief. So that's when I was talking earlier about having a needs-based system where people turn in a form. That money for reimbursement comes out of that $840,000 designated for victim relief.
And so, Silvia, as you mentioned, it sounded like this meeting was a little lackluster. Do you think that's a reaction of the community? Was there maybe, I think you had mentioned that they had talked about having this meeting before that they had it, so I assumed people knew about it. How do you describe that? Is that surprising to you? Does this perhaps represent some difficulty in relations between the church and the community of the survivors? What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think it's become a really sensitive topic, and the church leadership didn't want to make a big splash out of it. It is a lot of money, and frankly, from speaking to the pastor, he was worried that because it was so much money, it would rekindle that controversy that had really come to a boiling point in April. Things kind of started to simmer down. That Facebook page was frozen, and you kind of started hearing less and less of that controversy. And so they were really concerned that it would ignite that division again. So I think they tried to have it as quiet as possible. They, kept emphasizing that it would be really short, and they announced it and then pretty quickly left the stage, and people started leaving. So I had to run and try to get a quote from them. I think it definitely was a reaction to the sensitive nature of the topic.
And so that being the case, have you spoken to anybody that had a negative or positive reaction to this unveiling of that total sum around $3 million? Or do you think this might take a little bit more time to gauge reaction?
It might take a little bit more time. I spoke with one woman who I mentioned earlier, Lisa McNulty, and she said she was surprised that it was that much money. But she still is upset. She's upset that her grandchildren, she and her grandchildren, haven't gotten more funds from the church. Her grandchildren, one of them will be going off to college in a couple years. Another needs braces next year. She's taking care of them by herself, and she's genuinely concerned about how she's going to pay for all that. And in my April reporting, she had asked about this kind of longer term funding for her family. And Pat Duke had said that they were pretty much focused on immediate expenses right now, but that they were hoping to get to longer term ones in the future. So we'll have to wait and see for these longer term expenses how that plays out.
And so when you say that she was upset or disappointed, whatever word would be appropriate there, about what she seemed to think were not enough funds for her and her family dealing with the tragedy that obviously occurred, was that because she submitted forms and they were rejected, they were lower than the total that she submitted, or did she just not submit forms because she thought they should be, more on top of this and they should be sending out the money to the victims, making the process a little bit easier? How does she fall into all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So she hasn't submitted these forms. And so that's something that the church leadership are kind of upset about, is that she hasn't gone through their process. And I think part of that is in protest. She has a theory too, that she thinks everyone should have just received an equal amount of money, and that it shouldn't be doled out with this kind of needs-based system. And another part of it too is I think she's looking at the future. So there aren't receipts yet, but she's looking for future, and she's nervous, and she doesn't have those kinds of she doesn't have receipts yet. These are things that'll happen down the line. So the cost of her grandchildren going to college, does that qualify as a need, as a tragedy? And where does that line end? Will the church be expected to support her grandchildren throughout the rest of their educational careers because of what happened to their mother? So I think it does get into a gray area as to, how much the church can help out for all of these families. And something that the pastor said after the $3 million announcement, he told me in an interview, it sounds like a lot of money, but with all of the medical bills and all of the homes that need to be refitted for new disabilities and handicaps, he says that money is going to go through pretty quickly.
And also something I'd like to ask about, perhaps this has come up in your discussions with, survivors, family members of the victims. This seems all more focused to be after the fact. You submit receipts. Anyone who's done any type of, federal service, I'm a returned Peace Corps volunteer, and I had medical difficulties in the Peace Corps. And unfortunately, they just did not pay for everything they told me they would. And the things that they did pay for, I paid for first, and I submitted receipts. That's a very difficult situation to be in. Have people had issue with the system itself?
Yes, they have. But the church, as I understand it, is in keeping with IRS requirements, which basically state that after a kind of disaster in a community, that a needs-based system should be employed for distributing aid. So, the church leadership would argue we're just trying to follow the law.
Silvia, we're hitting the end of our time for today's interview here on the In-Depth podcast, but I do want to give you a chance to throw in anything else that we haven't gotten to yet today, or just make a finer point perhaps on something that we already have discussed. What are your final thoughts on this update to the Sutherland Springs shooting that, as we noted earlier, you have been covering since day one?
Yeah, I guess I would just add to, this was a choice that the leadership made to reveal this $3 million figure, or nearly $3 million. But they didn't actually have to. Most tax-exempt nonprofit organizations need to make public their financial details, but churches aren't required to. They don't have to make public how much they're making and how much they're spending and other kinds of records like that. So this was really a concerted effort by church leadership to be transparent with the congregation and to the public about how much they raised.
Immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau really digging deep with things she was doing, as she mentioned, back when she was an education reporter and just filled in for a friend one Sunday. And lo and behold, she's been able to follow this story and do some great reporting, these several months as this story has continued to unfold. And I assume we'll be doing so into the future, wearing quite a lot of hats over at the Express News, Silvia. So thank you once again for joining us, and hope to have you on the program again sometime in the future.
Thanks so much, Chance.
And thanks to San Antonio Express News immigration reporter Silvia Foster-Frau for joining me for today's episode of the In-Depth podcast, an interview program brought to you by expressnews.com. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.